Pentecostals, fundamentalism, and fire. Copious amounts of fire. That's what we're gonna talk about today, because that's my background. This morning, I got news that the president of the seminary that I went to, the pseudo seminary that I went to, is facing some sexual misconduct allegations, and I wanted to talk about it because I've been wanting to talk about my days at Fire School of Ministry for a long time, and this feels like the right moment. Fire School of Ministry was birthed out of the Brownsville revival, this multi-year revival that happened in Brownsville, Florida, where millions of people from around the globe came to this tiny little church in Florida, and tens of thousands of people gave their lives to Jesus. A lot of people, quit doing heroin and came to the faith.
Your past forgiven and forgotten. Freedom from addiction.
There was reports of miracles and healings. People were turning away from sin and giving their life to Christ and becoming missionaries left and right. It was a whole lot of hoopla there in that little peninsula. And so in order to stoke and cultivate the religious fervor that was being cultivated there, they started the Brownsville Revival School of Ministry. Afterwards happened what always happens in Protestant circles, and there was a church split. There was disagreements about the direction of the whole shindig, and so Dr. Michael Brown, who was one of the leading voices of the Brownsville Revival, branched off and started his own little shindig in Concord, North Carolina. And that little shindig was called Fire School of Ministry. And I still wear their t-shirt. I am 12 years out and I still have the t-shirt that I got freshman year. I think it was Jonathan Volk who designed this thing. If you're watching this, great job on the merch, bro. Anyway, FIRE is an acronym. It stands for Fellowship of International Revival and Evangelism. And it's hard to explain what it was. Normally when I talk about it, I refer to it as my pseudo-seminary days, because people just don't have any frame of reference for the kind of thing that FIRE was. I would often say when I was there that it was like the East Coast version of the Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry under Bill Johnson. FIRE was a 3-year, non-accredited degree in practical ministry. The non-accredited part is important. It wasn't like a legit seminary because you weren't ordained after it. It was sort of like you spent 3 years there, and then, the hope is that you become a missionary or something, or at least you get really into real estate and you put Bible verses on your business cards. And so when you hand out a business card, you're planting a seed. And I think when I was younger, I kind of poo-pooed how legit FIRE was. Right after I graduated, I was like, oh man, this was worthless. This was such a waste of time. And I gotta be honest, now that I'm older, I actually respect it a lot more than I did back then. It was a pretty decent education for what it was. The gist of the program was it was 3 years of Bible classes, and then in addition to that, there was also a lot of hands-on ministry that you were expected to do. So we had entire college-level courses on the New Testament, on the pastoral epistles, on apologetics, on counter-apologetics, on church planting, on missions. And after I graduated from Wheaton, I was able to kind of look back and realize, oh, those classes were actually way more legit than I realized. So perks to them for that. But the real value of the school was the intensity of the evangelism that you were expected to do. So every semester you would have kind of a different practicum that you would have to do. You would have to do some sort of ministry outside of class hours. So one semester I did a thing where I would go and protest at an abortion clinic. The dudes who stand outside of Planned Parenthood and hold up big posters of aborted fetuses, that was me, baby. Fun times, fun times. We would also do street evangelism. We would go, ask people on college campuses if we could pray with them. We once went to a gay pride parade and we're doing research about LGBT people's sense of sexual ethics, but then ultimately it was just kind of a ruse for us to get in there and preach the gospel to those people. So that was kind of interesting. And then we also would on occasion do door-to-door evangelism, especially in the hood. And I will never forget this. This is one of my favorite stories. We knocked on this dude's door once and he opens the door and he's this, yoked dude had just gotten out of prison. And we were like, hey, can we talk to you about Jesus? And he was like, oh man, I already studied all the religions. When I was in prison, I studied every religious book. I studied Christianity. I studied Islam. I studied Buddhism. If I were a less mature man, I would make a really inappropriate joke right there. Anyway, yeah, man, I don't know. It had its ups and downs. But the backdrop to all of that was this blazing, roaring intensity of religious fervor that I don't think I have ever seen since. Outside of groups like the Black Hebrew Israelites and ISIS, I don't think that I've ever seen fundamentalists who were more austere and passionate as the kids that I went to seminary with. And I'm not gonna lie, looking back on it, I wouldn't trade it for the world. Not because it wasn't a very bad time, but because now I'm a person who studies religion and tries to, honestly engage with people who are honestly wrestling with the divine. And those 3 years were the greatest window into novel religious movements that I could have ever asked for. It was 3 years of toiling and striving and 24-hour prayer meetings and prophetic words and rolling on the floor laughing and crying your eyes out and repenting again and again and again and begging God for mercy and forgiveness, and I will never forget it. And it has given me so much respect and so much compassion for weird, bizarre religious movements because I used to be a part of one. So let me talk about the good parts of fire and the bad parts of fire, because there were genuinely good parts of it. Kind of one of the less expected elements of fire was that there were a lot of metal kids there. Yeah, one of the faculty members actually used to own a Christian metal venue. And so she was kind of buddies with like a whole host of the big names in the Christian metal scene back in the 2010s. And the Christian metal scene is what raised me. Bands like For Today and Oh Sleeper and My Epic were the bread and butter of my entire existence. And so the fact that like a weirdly austere Pentecostal seminary was actually very free and expressive with like, yeah, go out to those metal shows and mosh around and preach Jesus to people. It was a really unique environment. And I'm appreciative that they didn't try to, stomp that side of me out of me. Yeah, I feel like I'm not harping on this enough. Like there were several Christian metal bands just among like the students who were enrolled at the seminary. Like they would go play secular shows and like scream into a microphone and then try to like pray and prophesy with people after the show. Another thing that I have to mention with the school is that the teachers there were a very mixed bunch. There were some professors there who straight up had no business teaching. And I remember at least one in particular where I straight up wrote the school a letter and told them that. Not because he was like ethically unqualified, I just didn't think he was very smart. So that was on the one hand. On the other hand, I had some professors there who were very intelligent and very meticulous with how they taught their class. And beyond that, there were some professors who were genuinely there for me. I still remember calling up one of my professors on a Saturday, having just gone through some shit in my home life, and I showed up on his doorstep sobbing, and he was there for me. And if you're watching this, you know who you are, and I endlessly appreciate you, man. I hope you're well. So that was the good part of the seminary. The bad part was most of the blisteringly white hot, ragingly intense hysteria that was just constant at the school. I remember we went on a missions trip to Mardi Gras in New Orleans, and it was several days of walking around and trying to preach and minister to homeless people and street kids and people who were drunk out of their mind on Bourbon Street. And I have this very like painful and vivid memory of us all like hopping out of the van. We were all just hyped up on the Holy Ghost and we were ready to go and take these streets for Jesus. And people jumped out of the van and just started yelling, like shouting and screaming. And Bourbon Street is already pretty weird, but man, we were a sight for sore eyes. I even remember when I first got to Fire, they had like an orientation ceremony, which was called, what was it called? Burn, Blaze, Fuego, Induction? Immersion. It was called Immersion. So we were up there for like 3 or 4 days for a prayer retreat, very intense, just sobbing on the carpet for hours and hours and hours. It was just speaker, prayer, worship, again and again and again, like a dozen times in a day. And so after, several days of prayer and fasting and worship, we got back to the campus and everyone was supposed to like drive home. But then there were some stragglers who were like, I don't know, guys, do you want to just like pray a little more? And the only correct answer when you're asked, do you want to pray, is yes. I just remember us, outside of the front of this locked building, and we were just praying for each other and for the nation and for God to bring revival. And the kind of like intense hysteria that just overtook everyone still stands out in my mind as incredibly jarring. One person starts crying and then another person starts prophesying about how that person has trauma and needs to break through with this, super special prayer. And then they're jumping up and down and claiming the name of Jesus. And then, somebody turns to the book of Philippians and starts quoting a passage. And then somebody else starts, crying on their knees and shouting to the heavens and rebuking Beelzebub. And that was my seminary experience. It's been long enough now that I can laugh about it, but I'm grateful that that was my seminary experience, because I think that that experience has more similarities to the beginnings of the historical Jesus movement than a lot of, nice and tidy button-up Baptist seminaries that you see today. Getting to be in an environment where the spiritual realm is taken so painfully seriously is really anachronistic, and I feel like it's a hard thing to understand until you've lived it, until you've been in a community that takes it super painfully seriously. So one of the other things about seminary that was less fun was sex. And it was very not fun because I wasn't having any. Sex at Fire, as with all fundamentalist religious communities, was taken very, very, very seriously. And to their credit, maybe it should be. Sex is a very big deal, and it should not be just, flippantly laissez-faire. Dating was frowned upon during our time at Fire, but in addition to that, we also had some pretty strict rules about dating and mixed gendered interactions. And I fully embraced all of those rules there, and I thought that most of them were kind of sensible. I want to make a longer video about this at some point because I feel like I have some unique hot takes about purity culture. And I feel like most of the purity culture content that blows up on YouTube, I actually slightly disagree with. I know Christians who are doing purity culture well. Granted, they would never call it purity culture, but they're actively trying to wait until they're married. And the reason why they're doing that is because they believe it will help foster a healthy and long-standing marriage. And I have a lot of respect for that. And I think that there are couples who have waited till marriage and they have done it so gracefully, and I think it's going to work out well for them. More power to you. But I think that I and my classmates at Fire became obsessive over it. This is probably TMI, but let's be honest, that's why you watch the show. I took sexual purity so seriously that I successfully stopped watching porn by the time I was 14. And beyond that, I didn't just stop watching porn, I had quit masturbating altogether.
Who likes to masturbate?
Let me clarify. I was a raging fapping machine from the ages of 11 to 14. And then at the age of 14, I realized, hey, I don't think that this is going to be advantageous to my future marriage. I'm going to stop. And so I struggled for a few months and got a little bit better and a little bit better. And would go a week at a time, 2 weeks at a time. And then finally around Christmas, at the age of 14, I just stopped. And from the age of 14 to 21, I did not masturbate a single time.
My gosh, what a incredible 7-year no fapping streak.
And if you're a woman watching this, you might be like, huh. If you're a guy watching this, your inclination might be to just straight up not believe me. Because, God, I know so many Christians who are really passionate about purity and not looking at porn and not masturbating. But kind of the unspoken secret is that usually it's the case that yeah, we all know that we shouldn't be doing it, and we all actively wrestle against trying to do it, but the number of people who actually have any long-standing success with it, wildly few and far between. And my classmates were often equally as austere, and they would sometimes self-flagellate in public anytime that they, had a lapse in judgment or they had a moral failing. I still remember a young girl piping up in the middle of class and being like, hey everyone, I just want to publicly repent and apologize because I've been addicted to pornography and I had a relapse this week. So yeah, we took sex very seriously at Fire. And punishment for sex at Fire was dealt with in a number of ways. I can still vividly remember this incident. One of my classmates had sex with one of my other classmates and she got pregnant. And I want to leave a little bit of room for grace in case I'm somehow misunderstanding the situation. But what I remember was that she was told to stand up in front of the entire student body and publicly confess her sin and tell everyone that she was pregnant. And for some godforsaken reason, she was there groveling in front of the entire class, and my male classmate who impregnated her was not there. And I don't know why. So fast forward to today, and I had the misfortune of waking up and seeing that there are some sexual misconduct allegations against Dr. Michael Brown. Dr. Brown was not only the president of the school, at the time, he was one of my favorite authors. I devoured his books. He also taught several of the night classes that I signed up for. And I even went with him to a conference for the Society of Biblical Literature down in Florida. And and I was also his valedictorian in the class of 2016. So he handed me my degree. So the primary allegation with Dr. Brown is that probably 20 some years ago, he developed an emotionally intimate connection with one of the secretaries. He was her employer ultimately, and he asked her for kisses on the lips. And on more than one occasion, he smacked her on her behind, and he was seen in public holding her hand. It sounds like they're currently in the process of doing a third-party investigation, so I don't want to say anything beyond that in case anything new comes to light. But for the sake of the point that I'm trying to make, it's actually not very important. No matter how many of these scandals come about, it always feels surprising. And even after you've deconverted, even after you've left this community, you still have some sort of like vestigial affinity for some of these people that you looked up to as a kid. You know, we've got the Mike Bickle stuff, the Ravi Zacharias stuff, there's the Steve Lawson scandal. And with all of these, it still breaks my heart. It's still sad to me. I think that some Christians are still dumb and naive enough to think that like, oh, you know, now that I'm an atheist, I just relish the idea of, you know, seeing their worldview crumble and seeing them get knocked down. And that's really not the case, man. Like, y'all have people cheering for you on the sidelines. If you're able to do it in a candor and a tone that's commendable. I think a common misconception with Christians is they'll say, oh man, you know, a lot of atheists have become atheists because their pastors, you know, had a moral failing.
I have sinned against you, my Lord.
And that's not the case. My atheism has nothing to do with how many pastors in my life have cheated on their wives. And spoiler alert, there's been a lot of pastors in my life who have cheated on their wives. Like, my youth pastor cheated on his wife, my pastor ended up getting divorced, then the other pastor that I was interning with eventually got a divorce from his wife as well, the evangelist that I like looked up to ended up committing suicide, and none of those things gave me any doubt with regards to Christianity. Because the logic there wouldn't really check out, right? Like, oh, my pastor cheated on his wife, therefore Jesus didn't rise from the dead. That's not a natural conclusion of things. And likewise, when I was a Christian, all of these Christians doing shitty things around me, that never rattled my faith in the gospel. It was like, yeah, of course people are gonna do shitty, dumb things, obviously. But the gospel message is God's response to our shittiness, not, you know, the protection from being shitty, right? But the subset of Christians who would, you know, maybe not like truly deconvert or even deconstruct, but they just kind of like quietly leave church. I think it's because they see that this is supposed to be the recipe for how to have a happy, healthy marriage. And for some reason, it keeps failing. Because the dream and the vision that I was sold and that all of my classmates were sold was that if you can rely on God and walk with Him and abstain from sexual immorality, then not only are you going to do the will of God, but these are the tools that you will have in place for attaining a happy marriage and a happy sex life with your future spouse. And these are the steps you take to get there. And beyond that, not only just like, hey, these are the steps you need to take in order to achieve a happy marriage, but here are the steps that you take in order to repress your shitty impulses.
I tell you, this has saved me from sin.
Because let's put our cards on the table. We all have shitty things that we want to do. The question is, how do you not do them?
If I could remember the way I felt after sinning and hold on to that, the next time temptation came knocking at my door, I'd say no.
And the answer has to be something like, well, you need to, flee from sexual immorality. You need to not even be alone in the same room with a woman. Anytime a temptation comes up, you need to pray earnestly and flee from it. You need to rest in the joy of the Lord and be, satisfied in His strength. And it seems like all of it just doesn't work. I remember a sermon that Dr. Brown preached, and truthfully, it's maybe one of the only sermons that I remember ever.
I tell you, you will never forget this message.
He's talking about this word in the Hebrew.
Say it again, acharit.
And it loosely translates to like aftermath. And so he says this line in the sermon over and over and over again. Remember the acharit, remember the acharit.
To never lose sight of the acharit. If he could have only seen his acharit.
And his point was just like, anytime you're tempted to sin, just remember the aftermath. Remember the fallout. Remember how, your entire world would be crumbling down if you actually did this horrible, no good, awful thing.
Because I'd remember the acharit, I'd remember the final consequences.
And let that propel you to not do the shitty thing that you want to do. And I remember watching that sermon. If I remember correctly, I actually watched it as I was like a visitor to fire, deciding whether or not I wanted to go there. Like they played a video of it at the front of the classroom, and I was so taken aback, with conviction.
If he could have only seen his acharit, I don't care what that young lady offered him. I don't care if 1,000 young ladies offered him whatever he wanted. He would have said, no, I won't touch it.
And I felt it through my bones that I like crawled up to the front of the classroom and just, head face down, prostrate before God. God, please let me remember the acharit. Please never let me give in to some, awful, no good sexual temptation. And, Dr. Brown was so passionate and emphatic in that sermon. And it felt like, man, this is the key to living a holy life. It's a battle, it's a war, and you got to keep your head in the game, and you just got to stay focused. And if you can do that long enough and you get the grace of God, then maybe your marriage will turn out okay, and you won't be another statistic in the sea of infidelity and divorces. But now I want to contrast Dr. Brown's sermon with a sermon that I preached. Fast forward about a year. My senior year in high school, I was the student chaplain. The high school that I went to, the private Christian high school that I went to, they asked me to come back and preach a sermon. Now, during my time at my high school, I was a pretty passionate preacher whenever I would preach to the high schoolers and the middle schoolers. But when they asked me to come back, I got it in my mind that I wanted to talk about sexual purity.
If you're looking for one specific sin that's nailed and spoken of in particular, at length, whole chapters devoted to it, it's sexual sin.
And I was always passionate when I was a chaplain, but this was bad. What had happened was the week before, I was hanging out with a friend who I had a very fat crush on.
The lips of an adulteress drip honey.
And not only was she, attractive, but worse, she was an atheist. And we were two horny 19-year-olds doing everything within our power to not make out with each other.
Her acharit is bitter as gall.
And I still remember walking with this girl by the pond, under the moonlight, our emotions running high, and thinking, I just want to give in to all of this and just embrace her. Just kiss the shit out of her.
No, one night, one sin, one time.
And I didn't. I stood my ground. I repressed those urges, and I said, no, I'm going to stick to my guns and stand on my principles, and I'm not going to do this. And then just for the week after that, I was just so miserably hot and bothered. And I just had to reinforce again and again and again that this is wrong, this is not God's time, that you cannot give into these urges or these desires. And I became frustrated with myself. I became angry at myself at how festering these desires and these thoughts were.
It takes a long time to climb up that mountain. It takes a long time to climb up that place where people respect you and you have a reputation for integrity and honor and trustworthiness.
Just this raging desire to kiss this girl, this sinful, evil desire to sleep with this girl. And I was angry at myself.
Slam the door in the devil's face.
Because I had probably, remained pure for like 5 years up until that point.
And walk away and leave it behind.
And it felt like I should be past this.
Otherwise you will go down.
And so when my high school asked me to come and preach a sermon, I got on stage and I screamed at those kids. And I yelled at them about how they needed to remain sexually pure, and they needed to quit watching pornography, and they needed to quit masturbating. And I just berated these kids, just screamed at them for like 20 minutes. Looking back, it is so easy to see that all of the passion and all of the fervor that I took out on those kids was because I was frustrated and angry at myself.
Tonight, I renounce Satan. Devil, you lose. I am not yours. I belong to Jesus.
And to this day, it is one of the most shameful episodes of my life, the way that I just let it rip on those kids. So fast forward a few years, and now I'm an atheist, and then I, at some point, did end up hooking up with this girl that I had a fat crush on. And we had a casual weekend together, and it was no big deal. Here's what I want. I want men to not cheat on their wives. I want every relationship that I see to be passionate and flourishing and happy and sexually active. And I don't really care what the metric is to get there. If I can find hard-hitting data that the way to do that is to, repress all of your other sexual urges and just beat this into yourself, then I'm here for it, man. The problem is, I don't think that it works. And I don't think that statistically, the people who are the best at successfully repressing those sexual urges are going to go on to live happy and healthy marriages. Because I feel like a casualty in the purity war culture, and I don't know that I'm ever going to recover. Because ironically, the thing that I so highly cherished, the idea of being a faithful and happy husband, I don't know how to get there. I don't know how to be that anymore. Because I've played the game where you beat it out of yourself, or you flagellate yourself and you pray to God to remove these urges, and you discipline yourself to stop masturbating and stop watching porn. And it didn't work. And for an alarming number of pastors, it also isn't working. And now I'm in a weird place where my trust and my confidence in anyone's ability to do this well is just gone. I just kind of assume at this point that everyone is cheating on their spouse, or they will do so eventually. And there's a small subset of people who will say like, well, this is a problem in that theological community, but our theological camp is largely immune from these lapses in moral and ethical judgment. And I just call bullshit. Every time a Pentecostal pastor has some sort of moral sexual failing, a whole bunch of conservative Baptists will come out of the woodwork and say, well, this is because they don't have a proper view of Scripture, and they are not truly in alignment with the Word of God, and that's why they have committed this grave no good sin. And then whenever a Baptist pastor commits adultery, the Pentecostal conservatives will come out of the woodwork and say, well, this is because he didn't have a true walk with the Holy Spirit. He had head knowledge, but he wasn't relying on the grace of God. And then the liberal Methodists and Episcopalians will come out of the woodwork and say, well, see, this is the trauma of fundamentalism, rearing its ugly head, and this is what happens when you repress sexual urges. And I'm not entirely convinced that they have a better hit rate either. And I think the scariest thing of all is that I'm not confident that I wouldn't do something like that. There's a lot of pearl clutching with shit like this, and there's a lot of finger pointing, and this community did that, or that community had this shitty doctrine that led to this shitty thing. But I'm not confident in my own ability to make it through this life without doing some, unthinkable travesty. I'm not confident in my own ability to make it through 50 years of marriage without cheating on my wife. When I think about the striving and the agony that I put myself through, I feel a sense of apprehension to ever putting myself through that again. Like I followed the protocol, and now I'm afraid of monogamy. I did it better than almost any Christian I've ever met. I've never met a Christian who has been able to go that long without beating their meat. And how did I turn out? How am I faring now? The longest relationship I've ever had was a year. And the thought of cheating on a woman scares me so much that I would rather just be single. The people who are the products of the fallout of trying to live so puritanically, I don't think that they're thriving on average. Dr. Brown's tagline in his radio show is "Your voice for moral sanity and spiritual clarity."
Your voice for moral sanity and spiritual clarity.
And the alumni of the school that he founded are some of the most morally confused and spiritually hazy people that I know. Not all of them. Some of y'all rock. To any of my fellow Crispies out there, how's it going? Love y'all. So I don't know. I wish that there were some way to, generally promote a message of love and, family values without drilling it into people with this level of puritanical fervor, because I don't think it ends well. And I don't know that I will ever be mature enough to settle down and become the husband and father that I wanted to. Feels like I had this dream implanted in me, and then I was given bad instructions on how to get there. Dr. Brown is pretty famous as an anti-trans advocate. There's a lot of talk and discussion about the mutilating of children's bodies. And for what it's worth, I'm still developing my opinions on the trans movement and the ins and outs of this very complicated discussion. But for what it's worth, I know that Dr. Brown has talked a lot about these disfigured bodies, these butchered bodies in the trans community. And I remember being a young Christian, and I remember having several of my leaders fail, And I remember reading those verses from Jesus that says, if your right eye causes you to sin, cast it out. And I had serious considerations based on all of that for castrating myself. Like, I genuinely began to think that my sexuality in its totality posed the threat of being more of a risk than a spiritual asset. And so I genuinely contemplated the idea of just getting a meat cleaver and butchering myself. Oh man, what if I cheat on my wife? What if I, use this dick to do something awful? Uproot the problem. Just imagine like a 17-year-old kid waddling into class one day and the teacher's like, oh, what happened? And he's like, well, I'm pure now. I'm no longer a threat. I no longer have the possibility of being a bastard. To all my fire friends, past and present, hope y'all are thriving. I know these are tumultuous times. Best wishes to the fire community. I hope that Dr. Brown comes out of this well, whole and healed, and I hope that no further allegations surface. I hope that this entire thing was ultimately pretty minimal. To the pseudonymous victim, Aaron, I'm so sorry. You didn't deserve that. My name is Jared. I'm an atheist.
Lord, I pray something I don't know that I've prayed before. Lord, I pray this for me. I pray this for everyone here who says, Lord, I want you. Lord, I pray that you would embarrass us and expose us before you'd allow us to destroy our lives for good.